There's now so much illegal marijuana grown in Britain that the country's become a net exporter. But this secret narcotics trade has an even more sinister side. Vietnamese crime gangs are trafficking children to work in Britain's cannabis farms, exploited by the drug lords, criminalised by the police, and now trapped by fear of both.
Ở một mình như thế tôi rất là sợ. Nó bảo là ra khỏi nhà là rất là nguy hiểm bởi vì sẽ bị kẻ trộm mà còn ra khỏi nhà mày không có giấy tờ gì trong người tùy thân thì mày ra mà cảnh sát hỏi là mày sẽ bị bắt.
Drugs warrant this morning at an address on Nixon Street. Male occupant believed to be growing cannabis. Kelly, if there's guys inside, you're the arresting officer, and you just assist, okay?
Britain has become the front line in the ongoing war against cannabis cultivation in Europe. A decade ago, the UK had never even heard of a cannabis factory. Now, in any town, on any given week, police across Britain are raiding 3 farms a day.
Go, 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 go!
At one of the raided addresses, a man was arrested and taken into custody.
And while other drugs, such as cocaine and heroin, are smuggled in from South America and Afghanistan, nearly 90% of the cannabis consumed in the UK is homegrown. Authorities say the problem is so endemic and widespread that the UK has now become an international exporter of the drug. And what is more remarkable is that it is not British nationals dominating the trade, but Vietnamese criminal gangs running the large-scale cannabis operations.
I'm going to photograph it. There's the crop. It's obviously recently crushed crop, that's quite fresh.
A cannabis factory is a high-profit, low-risk enterprise. It can cost $30,000 to start up with hydroponics and lights, which is recouped in 2 months after the first harvest. In a year, a single factory can make over $1 million. But the price for this readily available drug comes with a human cost. In order to keep this dark trade thriving in Britain, an exploitable workforce is required, one that is defenseless, obedient, and invisible. Some gangs have found this ideal, controllable labor in the form of Vietnamese children, trafficked for the purpose of growing cannabis for Britain's black market. Some are as young as 13, brought to the UK by debt bondage under false pretenses of legal work. They are made to work as gardeners and sometimes guards, shut inside the properties 24 hours a day, watering and tending the plants behind blacked-out windows with no ventilation. Exact numbers are impossible to collate, yet what is clear is that Vietnamese children are being trafficked, arrested, and prosecuted for cultivating cannabis plants in the UK. Rightly or wrongly, many are viewed as criminals first, victims later.
What's emerging in new information about child trafficking is that by far the majority of children appear to be coming into the country being trafficked for illegal criminal activities. Cannabis factories, DVD factories, benefit fraud, other forms of crime, begging, stealing. This now is the highest profile of child trafficking.
Trang is one of those children. Just shy of his 16th birthday, agents trafficked him 6,000 miles across the world. It took him 4 months to get to England and less than 1 week to find himself working in a cannabis factory. He has asked us to disguise his identity for fear of retaliation from traffickers.
I'm from middle of Vietnam. I'm 18 years old now, and I left home in summer 2007. Anh trai tôi cũng bị tai nạn gãy chân nữa, cho nên cũng phải đi viện mà mất tiền nhiều. Gia đình tôi bị nợ nhiều. Gia đình tôi khó khăn như thế thì họ bố mẹ tôi đi mượn tiền của những cái bọn agency đó và để trả nợ ở chỗ hospital, và gia đình tôi phải trả một nửa trước là $2.500 trước, rồi tôi sang đây tôi phải làm lao động cho cái đường dây đấy để tôi còn trả tiếp một nửa tiền nữa. Tôi chỉ nghe được những cái lời kiểu họ nói tốt về khi sang đây thôi, nhưng tôi không ngờ là sang đây, tôi không biết được là sang đây làm gì và cuộc sống cái này thế nào.
Chris Beddoe is the director of ECPAT UK, an anti-trafficking group advocating for the rights of young people. She has worked closely with many children that have been found in cannabis factories.
They're deceived, they're lured to come to the UK on the hope of a dream, a better life, maybe a job or education. And when they come here, they find that they're trapped. They've got to work in these cannabis factories to pay back enormous debts. They live under debt bondage and under the fear of threat from them or from their families at home.
Andy Baker, Deputy Director of the British Police's Serious Organised Crime Agency, heads up the investigations on Vietnamese criminal gangs and cannabis in the UK. He explains how traffickers smuggle children from the other side of the world and across the English Channel into Britain.
They tend to come in through transit countries. They travel across China, into Russia, into Ukraine. There they travel across the green border into EU kind of staging points. And obviously the most difficult point to come across is the Channel. And they will take extreme measures to come across. And we've even seen them now being secreted within black bin liners and completely covered, so that there's no CO2 emissions to avoid capture from the probes.
Tôi sang Pháp thì có người Việt Nam ở đấy đón tôi và đưa tôi vào trong khu rừng. Đấy đưa tôi ra đến chỗ cái bãi đỗ xe Pháp của lorry để đèo lên xe và xe sẽ chở sang England.
The main difference between people smuggling and human trafficking is the intention to exploit. There's always an element of exploitation in human trafficking. People smuggling, yes, it might be a difficult journey, but they pay their money, they get here and then they're free to leave. But in human trafficking, they're not. They're locked into some form of exploitation.
In France, Trang was given a single coin and told to call a number when he arrived in the UK. An unknown man came to collect him and drove him to the north of England.
Lần đầu tiên tôi ở một cái nhà to và ở một mình như thế tôi rất là sợ, mà tôi không biết cái cây là cây gì, mà điện sáng rất nhiều nên tôi rất là lo sợ. Nó bảo là ra khỏi nhà là rất là nguy hiểm bởi vì sẽ bị kẻ trộm, mà còn ra khỏi nhà mày không có giấy tờ gì trong người tùy thân thì mày ra mà cảnh sát hỏi là mày sẽ bị bắt.
Some are locked into cannabis farms, literally locked in. They're not allowed to leave the premises. The whole premises are turned over to cannabis production. And we identified that it was a growing problem. It's a form of modern day slavery, but it's around cannabis.
Gentlemen, this is a service update from the London Bridge control room. A good service is operating on all London Underground lines.
Trang was told by the Vietnamese agents that it would only take a few months to repay his debts once he reached the UK. But once he was inside the cannabis factory, he never saw a penny. The invisible population who live in Britain's cannabis factories are not all hardened criminals, but children lured into bonded labour for the drugs trade. Many, like Trang, believe they will work off their debt in a restaurant or a shop, but soon find out their handlers have other plans. Instead of the streets being paved with gold, they live in a shadowy underworld where their freedom depends on the readiness of a potent plant for black market sale.
Dạ, họ biết gia đình tôi ở Việt Nam và họ phải quản lý tôi để tôi làm cho họ để trả nợ ở Việt Nam, trừ nợ. Tôi không biết trước được bởi vì khi họ làm giấy tờ thì họ nói là rất là tốt, nên tôi cũng nghĩ là tốt thôi. Bởi vì sang đây tôi không có ai để nương tựa với ai, tôi không biết tiếng Anh và tôi không có tiền ở trong người thì tôi không biết đi đâu làm gì, tôi không thể trốn được, tôi phải ở lại
We traveled to Vietnam to investigate why some of Vietnam's young people are winding up inside Britain's cannabis farms. The export labor industry in Vietnam is big business. Each year, over 100,000 of its citizens leave the country to make their fortunes overseas. The government widely supports this, and for good reason. Over $2 billion a year in remittances is fed back into the country. It has become the backbone of the economy. It uses labor agencies to arrange the travel for its workers, but many cannot afford the initial outlay of $20,000 the agencies charge. As a consequence, many vulnerable people fall prey to traffickers, who use a number of scams to get them into debt bondage. They form the beginning of a link to a chain of exploitation that stretches from the South China Sea to the English Channel. We were denied access to film in Vietnam due to the highly sensitive nature of this issue, so had no alternative but to go undercover as tourists. Ms. Nguyen is a Hanoi-based lawyer who specializes in labor trafficking cases. Due to the work she does and the clients she defends, she fears the state police is monitoring her. By speaking to us, she risks losing her ability to practice law and could face imprisonment.
Để được ra nước ngoài thì thường là những cái người này họ sẽ phải trả những cái khoản tiền chi phí cho những cái kẻ buôn người rất là lớn. Khi mà người ta ở trong cái hoàn cảnh khó khăn như thế thì người ta không thể tự có cái số tiền để chi trả được. Và thường là họ sẽ phải vay ngân hàng, thế chấp bằng nhà cửa, bằng bảo lãnh, hoặc là có thể có nhiều trường hợp là họ phải vay nặng lãi ở quê nhà. Họ phải làm việc nhiều giờ nhưng mà không được trả lương, thì họ không có tiền để gửi về Việt Nam để trả cho các khoản nợ này, dẫn đến họ ở trong một cái vòng luẩn quẩn là lúc nào họ cũng phải làm việc cật lực để kiếm tiền, nhưng mà tiền thì họ vẫn không có được, và nợ ở quê nhà thì họ vẫn không trả được.
We traveled south from Hanoi, deep into the province of Nam, where many traffic victims, including Trang, have come from. His relatives have disappeared, but we found other families in a similar situation. Tan last saw his brother 6 months ago, who left to work in England. He is desperate to find out what has happened to him.
Sẽ tính về cả tiền, nếu mà xính nhá, tính đi hết tất cả là 620 triệu. Tiền Việt thì tính ra khoảng độ chừng toàn, tính ra tiền đô thì 1.200 triệu, và hết khoảng độ chừng là tầm 30.000. Không, khi đi thì nhà em có xả 3 giai đoạn. Giai đoạn đầu tiên là em không có gì. Giai đoạn thứ hai là nhà em sang Pháp á. Và bắt đầu khi xe đi qua phật phà của từ Pháp mà sang Anh ấy, khi sang là Anh xong rồi, người nhà phải trả hết. Và người ở gần nhà ấy chạy mà, nó có hỏi thì bảo nói kiểu là sắp lại trục giặc làm ăn gì đó, người ta chưa điện về đâu.
In Vinh, a depressed port city in the heart of the province, we met a local named Vu, who explained how people find themselves trapped into doing illegal work.
Vì người ta muốn đi nước ngoài bởi vì có nhiều lý do. Lý do thứ nhất ấy, thì có nghĩa là ở nhà cái thu nhập nó không được cao. Và thứ hai nữa là muốn ra nước ngoài ấy, để kiếm thêm tiền, để sau khi từ nước ngoài trở về sẽ có thêm thu nhập. Thì cái đấy nếu như mà sau khi đi về mà không kiếm được tiền ấy thì người ta đành phải bán đất bán nhà để mà trả nợ thôi, chứ biết làm sao được. Không có giấy tờ thì người ta phải sống giống như mình chui lủi ở bên nước ngoài ấy. Ngoại ngữ mình không biết, tiền nước ngoài mình không biết, thì người ta bảo làm việc gì thì miễn là có tiền nên người ta sẵn sàng làm thôi.
To date, no one has been prosecuted in Vietnam for labor trafficking offenses. Many accuse the government of turning a blind eye in exchange for greater wealth from overseas. However, due to the growing severity of the problem and the government's perceived lack of response, last year the US State Department published its Trafficking in Persons report. Vietnam was placed on the Tier 2 watch list, which is a step closer to sanctions if there is not a change within the country. The report states, the government of Vietnam does not fully comply with the minimum standards for the elimination of trafficking. It did not show evidence of progress in criminally prosecuting and criminally punishing labor trafficking offenders and protecting victims of all forms of trafficking, particularly victims of labor trafficking. As a result, pressure has been building on the Vietnamese government to address this growing crisis. They have launched a new PR campaign to show they've got a handle on the problem.
Liên hiệp Vương quốc Anh và Bắc Ireland là một quốc đảo ở Tây Bắc châu Âu. Có khí hậu ôn hòa, có nhiều thời gian trong năm bị sương mù bao phủ. nên quốc gia này còn được gọi là xứ sở sương mù.
This new public service film, funded by the British authorities and broadcast across Vietnam, aims to highlight the violent realities of cannabis cultivation in the UK.
Cửa sổ thường có những bàn trông sắt để chống người trong nhà bỏ trốn và chống người ngoài.
Many young people witness extreme violence and torture while locked into cannabis farms.
Put his finger onto a block here, and they also discussed killing him.
They can't turn to the police, they can't turn to the authorities, and we know certainly of 6 murders where they've either lost a crop, they've been ripped off, or the crops has diminished and been exposed. And we also know that there's a message to the other Vietnamese that are here unlawfully as gardeners, that the perpetrators of the murder and the violence make sure that the violence is extreme. So there's a message going back home to their loved ones and their families to say it's happened as well. Because it's a fairly small, tight community from where they hail.
Châu Á khác.
Đánh cái người cũng tầm tuổi như tôi đấy mà đánh đưa vào trong rừng để đánh. Rồi là sau đó không cho ăn uống gì và sau đấy là bắt cái thằng đấy về ở nhà tôi và xích vào cái ghế của tôi ngồi và bảo là sẽ đánh nữa mà nếu thằng đấy không khai hay là không làm gì đó tốt cho nó.
What did you do after that?
Khi tôi biết được cái chuyện đấy họ không tốt thì tôi cũng rất là lo, nhưng mà một thời gian khoảng một.
A few days later, all the gang members were arrested in a police raid. Trang was among them. But instead of being rescued, he was found guilty of drugs offences for cannabis cultivation and placed in a youth offenders prison.
Tôi ở trong tù thì được cái người cùng bị bắt đó, họ viết thư đến cho tôi và kiểu có những nhiều lời đe dọa không được nói cho cảnh sát, bởi vì đang nợ và tôi sẽ khai hết về cái chuyện đấy cho cảnh sát thì tôi rất là sợ.
After 8 months in prison, Trang was released early on the grounds that he had been trafficked. However, he now has a criminal record and is facing deportation. Shabir Qureshi is a criminal lawyer based in Birmingham, in the West Midlands of Britain. He has worked on a number of cases involving children in cannabis factories.
They're usually from families where they have very little contact with the outside world, so they wouldn't know the difference between the United Kingdom, France, Germany, America, or whatever. And once they get to this end, that's when I suppose the threats would start, that you've got to do what we're telling you. But they're now stuck in the system. I think there is a perception that anybody in the drugs industry, however they've got there, knows what they're doing is wrong, and therefore should not be doing it, and therefore why should they have any sympathy? Having said that, we're all part of the criminal justice system, and it's a matter of us looking at the individual. There's a phrase I like to look at. It's just as important to exonerate an innocent man as it is to convict a guilty man. But sometimes that's not the priority. The priority is to convict at all costs.
Those who deal with these cases can cite numerous examples.
I was once involved in a case of a young person because he'd been prosecuted and was facing a court trial. And there was the prosecutor and other professionals standing in court saying he was a mastermind, a drugs mastermind. He was the only person found in that house, a 14-year-old boy. Is it because they couldn't find an adult? Did they want to just prosecute someone so it was easier to prosecute the child than go looking for the real adults that were the mastermind?
I think the complex issues for these kind of cases, though, is that it's not just simply a case of an exploited child. You've got immigration issues, and immigration is a political hot potato at the moment. The government, whoever's in power, is always very mindful of public perception. And being soft on immigration is always seen as political suicide.
In rented homes and vast industrial sites around the UK, cannabis factories are on the rise. Yet after 7,000 raids last year alone, resulting in hundreds of arrests, how much closer are the UK authorities to catching the gangs that run the factories and the traffickers that bring in the workers?
We've been very successful dealing with the people that traffic. We have worked closely with the Vietnamese authorities in sharing information whereby we have exposed to them what we know. They are dealing locally with the travel agents, which I think is a too soft a word for these organised criminals that really exploit. Now, that dents them. That does hurt, especially when you take away their assets, especially when you take away their drugs, especially when you're taking away their livelihood.
But while Vietnamese now form the largest group of foreign nationals inside UK prisons, the prosecution records of traffickers paint a different picture. The latest published records show that between 2004 to 2009, only 7 people were convicted of labour trafficking offences in England and Wales. Yet Vietnamese children are still ending up behind bars.
We know that there's probably at least 100 Vietnamese children in prison today as a result of being charged with cannabis or related offences. The government's still not prepared to say that they will go into prison and assess every single one of those children to see if they've been trafficked. That level of denial, fueled by the fact that, you know, once they come out, they can be easily deported as a foreign national prisoner, really does make us think, what is the government worried about? Why is it hiding? Why isn't it prepared to assess every single child that's in prison today?
Political and public opinion has often led the police agenda over this hot-button issue, resulting in scores of arrests and deportations for illegal immigration and drugs offences. However, the UK has been signatory to the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings since 2008, which states that recruiting children for forced labour constitutes trafficking. A report by the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group, comprised of watchdog organisations such as Amnesty International and UNICEF, is critical on what it sees as the continued criminalisation of children in cannabis farms. It states, the UK authorities have either not considered trafficking or have concluded that adolescents were not trafficked, even though they have been brought from Southeast Asia and introduced illicitly into the UK, and are almost entirely dependent on adults who give them orders. This interpretation of UK law and of international conventions is extremely worrying. The police and the Crown Prosecution Service have not responded to cases involving Vietnamese children in accordance with the convention.
This train is the service from London, Victoria.
In response to this pressure, last month the Crown Prosecution Service, Britain's criminal justice body, issued new guidance for prosecutors. It states that victims of trafficking, particularly children, will no longer be treated as criminals. It also says it will listen to charities who actually work with the victims, and not only the police. Many, however, are waiting for the rhetoric to be put into practice.
If we don't get it right with cannabis factories, it will mean that we're constantly going to struggle against all the other forms of child trafficking for organised criminality.
At risk from the gangs who trafficked him and the labour agents he owes money to, Trang is determined to fight deportation back to Vietnam.
Hôm nay tôi phải ra tòa để kháng cáo lại tòa việc tôi xin tị nạn ở đây. Tôi cũng có một phần lo lắng bởi vì là không biết được họ sẽ cho tôi ở lại hay là không, mình không biết.
That day, the judge postponed the hearing as the proper evidence was not submitted by the UK authorities regarding his trafficking status. Trang is still awaiting the court's decision. Last year, only 58 children were considered trafficked when found in cannabis farms, while far more were arrested, imprisoned, and deported. The threat many of these young people face cannot be overestimated. Vietnamese children make up the largest group that disappear from care. Many of those missing are found to be re-trafficked back into cannabis factories. Some say they have been kidnapped. Others believe it is the physical or psychological threats made to them and their families, while others claim it is the weight of debt bondage. Whatever the reasons may be, these children have slipped back into the shadows, back into the cycle of the cannabis trade.